Psalms of disorientation, when the claims of the Psalms of orientation no longer ring true. It turns out very often that keeping of the Torah does not lead to prosperity, and more often than that, it turns out that neglecting the Torah does not lead to perishing, because wicked people prosper. So it's a big problem. Almost 1/3 of the 150 Psalms are laments, complaints, protests. That's a lot. And for most of the church, Anglicans probably are a little bit different, but not much. For most of the church, the only psalm of disorientation that we use is Psalm 22, because we can't avoid it, because Jesus quoted it on the cross. So it does come up in the lectionary and in the liturgy, but we, by and large, are free to neglect those others. So what we do is to deny the rhetoric of the church, the language of disorientation. And as I said last night, I believe that blanking out that third of the book of Psalms invites people to great guilt. So if something's wrong, it's my fault. Or it invites people to great denial that I have to keep pretending it's working when in fact it is not working. So what I want to suggest is that what the Psalms of disorientation do is to lift up and call attention to the reality of human loss and human pain without making moral judgments about it, about whose fault it is. It is simply a given of human life that needs to be processed theologically. And these Psalms, it seems to me, are so important because they are models of the way in which ancient Israel and then the church learns to have faith in the midst of disorientation and pain and loss, and learns to worship and pray in the midst of disorientation and pain and loss. So I want to start with Psalm 39. Some of you now will be tracking this in your Bibles, and the rest of you will have to take my word for it. Psalm 39, I should simply note in passing, is one of only two Psalms, two of the disorientation Psalms that do not have a good ending. That's not what I'm going to talk about right now, but I'll get to that later. But Psalm 39 starts out with the psalmist saying that I guard my ways so that I do not sin with my tongue. What he says is, I'm not going to say anything bad about God in the presence of wicked people because I don't want to give them any more ammunition for their unfaith. I was silent, and I kept still, and I held my peace, but it didn't work. My distress grew worse, and my heart became hot within me. The fire burned, and then I spoke. So I think these first three verses are a description of somebody in some kind of pain or suffering or loss who decided to pretend to continue to live in the world of orientation by just shutting up, and it didn't work. Now, the reason I think it's a nice place to start our topic for this morning is that what Israel discovered is that you have to break the silence. You have to say something. And that connects with what I said about Freud's great insight that finally you have to talk about this stuff in the presence of someone who will take it seriously. So I take these three verses to be an opening to say that Israel in disorientation has to break the silence. Now, if you read through Psalm 139, I believe you get all of the contradiction because if you look in verse 10, for example, the psalmist says to God, "Remove your stroke from me. I am worn down by the blows of your hand. Quit beating up on me." But verse 7 says, "And now, O Lord, what do I wait for? What do I hope for? My hope is in you. Deliver me." So these contradictory inclinations, it strikes me like a very small child. Mother's holding the small child, and the child is angry and starts beating on the mother's breast. Does that a little while, and then starts sucking its thumb and snuggles up to mother because there's no place else to go. And early on, the child begins to develop those kind of ambivalent feelings toward mother, of being the only safe place. But because mother doesn't always do what I want mother to do to make me happy, then I have some anxiety and I have some stress about that. And I think that that's the sense that Psalm 39 gives you about Israel's predicament with God, that there isn't anywhere else to go, but it is also maddening. Now, in the Old Testament, as I mentioned last night, the big disorientation is the destruction of Jerusalem. And I'll not go into it now, but you may know that the book of Lamentations consists in 5 long poems about grief over the destruction of Jerusalem. And if you look at those 5 poems, you will see that they have 22 verses, 22 verses, 66 verses, 22 verses, 22 verses, because they are all but the last one are alphabetic. And what they do is to process the grief from A to Z to get the whole thing said. And you may know that in the practice of Jewish worship, on the 9th of Av in the Jewish calendar, there is still a festival day to observe the destruction of Jerusalem. So Jews have not gotten over the destruction of Jerusalem even until now, and there is no doubt that that memory of that definitive disorientation is what is feeding the Zionism in the state of Israel today. In the New Testament, I mentioned last night that the big disorientation is certainly the crucifixion of Jesus. And I don't know whether any of Canadian churches I remember from my childhood used to have to go to church on Good Friday for 3 hours. Did any of you ever do that? And you remember that those 3 hours were portrayed both liturgically and in the biblical text as darkness and heaviness and threat and gloom, because liturgically what those 3 hours signify is that when Jesus is dead on the cross, the powers of chaos turn loose and take control of the world for 3 hours. And I suppose our ancestors thought that if the chaos is on the loose that way, then being in church is maybe the safest place you can be while the world is under threat like that. But the other thing to observe in the stories of Jesus is that Jesus deals with many smaller disorientations of blind people and lame people and lepers and poor people, and in the case of Lazarus and Jairus' daughter, dead people. And what you notice in those narratives is that the needy person or the family of the dead person come up and summon Jesus to come into their life or into their house. You remember the blind Bartimaeus in Luke says, Son of David, have mercy on me. So that's a very small prayer of lament. When I was in seminary, I was taught out of the tradition of St. Augustine that God takes all initiatives, prevenient grace and all that stuff. But it's not true. If you look at the way those transactions work with Jesus, the needy person must take the initiative and must summon Jesus into the transaction. So I want to suggest that Psalms of disorientation are basically prayers that seek to mobilize God on the assumption that if you don't summon God, nothing will happen. And that causes us to think, I believe, primitively about the power of prayer. That we really are summoning God into the transaction, because if you can get God to pay attention, then everything will change, because God has the power to change. Karl Barth, the greatest theologian, Protestant theologian of the 20th century, said in his little book on the Lord's Prayer that prayer causes God to do things that God would not otherwise do. That's very primitive. And all we know about that is that people who are in great distress do pray that way, even though people whose lives are well-oriented might think that that's kind of foolish and superstitious to pray that way. Now, these prayers are, on the one hand, they are highly stylized so that you can begin to see the patterns and you can spot the genre about how it works. But the most amazing thing about these prayers that are so stylized is that they are amazingly concrete. And we do not have any trouble imagining, and it is an active imagination, we do not have any trouble imagining what the context was that caused people to pray this way. And most scholars believe that the context of these lament psalms was sickness or prison or social isolation. You got to remember that in the ancient world, life was very communal, and you had to be a member of the village or of the tribe. And if you were rejected or cast out or excommunicated, it really amounted to a sentence of death. And therefore, the prayers of being rejected or cast out or neglected or abandoned are very urgent kinds of prayers. But the concreteness of these prayers, and I think this is worth our paying attention to, the concreteness of a prayer so that you can imagine an ancient man or woman praying this prayer in a particular circumstance, even if we have to imagine the circumstance, permits us to transfer the psalm from that concreteness to our own concreteness. And I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that whenever we use these psalms privately or liturgically, we do tend, without reflecting on it, we do tend to transfer the concreteness from one place to another. So what I want to do is to talk about a few of these psalms. Then I want to make some generalizations about them, and then I want to draw some conclusions. And I will start with Psalm 22. That seemed to me to be the obvious place to start, because at least the first verse of it is familiar to us. And you may know that many interpreters think that when Jesus quotes the first word, the first verse of the psalm on the cross, that we are to understand in Matthew and Mark, where it happens that the whole psalm is to be understood. So Psalm 22 really provides a kind of a script for the faith of Israel and perhaps for the story of Jesus' life. It begins in, and I'm taking this as a representative case, so I will spend some time on it. The first two verses are a complaint that God is unavailable, silent, indifferent, neglectful, unfaithful. It is an accusation, my God, you are my God, and I'm counting on it. But the word forsaken, you remember, you get that in Aramaic in the gospel. They quote the Aramaic in the gospel story of the crucifixion, Eli, Eli, avzatani, the verb is avzatani. It means to divorce or to break covenant or to act unfaithfully. And that can be a first sense in disorientation, that the reason I am in this disorientation is because God is not faithful. What a way to start a psalm. And you don't get any answer. Now verses 3 to 5, it is as though after verse 2, and you have to imagine this being dialogical. It is after verse 2, God said, well, why should I pay attention to you? So you got to give God some reasons. Scholars call these motivations. You got to motivate God to be interested in your disorientation. So here's the first motivation. Well, first of all, because you're holy. Don't forget that, God. It is as though you have to remind God about who God is, because God has some amnesia about that. And the second motivation is that our mothers and fathers trusted you, and they cried out, and you saved them, and all I'm asking you to do is to do for me what you did for them. You ought to be your consistent self. Then there's more complaint. I am a worm. I'm scorned. I'm despised. I'm mocked. People mock me and say, yeah, yeah, yeah. Here's a motivation, verse 9, yet it was you. I was your idea, God. You caused me to be born from the womb, and I've been counting on you since I was born. You've been my God. So in verse 10 you have my God that circles back to my God in verse 1. And then most remarkably, it is not until verse 11 you get the first petition. So it's 10 verses to get ready to ask, and the asking is not very demanding. All I'm asking is that you don't be so far away. So come on over here into the disorientation with me, because they could imagine that God really likes to spend time with the properly oriented people because they sing such happy songs of praise. But get over here. This is where you ought to be, and this is where I need you. And then there's more complaint, because you gotta use hyperbole to impress God with your need. So many bulls, and then lions. So he's either in a zoo, or he's imagining, or he's hallucinating. I'm in jeopardy. Verses 14 and 15 are about psychosomatic illness. My bones are all out of joint, and my heart is melting like wax, and my mouth is drying up, and my tongue sticks to my jaw, and I feel like I'm going to die. Then verse 16 goes back to the imagery of animals. There are many dogs and evildoers. I mentioned last night that technical phrase, evildoers. These are people that are willing to be bad. And I have to keep doing an inventory of my bones. And you remember verse 18 is quoted about they cast lot for Jesus' garments. Verse 19 is the second petition, and it's just like verse 11. Do not be far away. But now it gets expansive. Come quickly, deliver, save. And then you have a sword and a dog and a lion. This is hyperbolic language. So people in disorientation engage in regressive speech. They say wild kinds of things that well-ordered people would never think to say, and they're the kind of things that well-ordered people think you ought not to say. I once was teaching in a summer program with a haughty faculty member from Yale, and when he found out we were doing lament psalms, he said, I don't know why you do that. I've never been that angry. And I thought, well, I wouldn't either were I tenured at Yale, but, you know. Now, if you have a text, notice do you have a space between the first line of 21 and the second line of 21? If you don't have, you should mark it and make a space in your Bible. Because amazingly, in the second line of 21, you have rescued me. So something has happened, and this happens regularly in the Psalms. So we are to imagine that God has heard, that God has come, that God has answered, that God has delivered, that God has changed the circumstance of the psalmist so that from the last half of 21 on, you can imagine that the psalmist is on his way to a new orientation. So 1 to 21a is about being in the pit, and 21b through the end of the psalm in 31 is about going on to begin new life. Now, if you want to relate that to the life of Jesus, you could say that 21 through 21a is the Friday story of crucifixion, and 21b to the end is the Sunday story of resurrection, so that crucifixion, resurrection become kind of a shaping typology for the way these prayers work. And since we do not know in the Christian tradition what happened to Jesus on Friday night, the gospel writers are silent about that. We do not know what happened in the middle of verse 21 that caused the change. But if you track on down from verse 22, what you get is extraordinary praise. So I will tell your name to my brothers and sisters. I'll tell the family that God has come and changed things for me. I will praise in the congregation. I will, verse 25, I will praise in the great congregation. Maybe that's Jerusalem. I will pay my vows. It happens sometimes that people tell the priest, you know, if I can get out of this alive, if God loves me that much, I'll give another $100 to the church. And he's doing it. And then in verse 26, he holds a big dinner for poor people. And then in verse 27, all the families of the nation will worship. And if you move on down to verse 30, future generations will hear the story of my rescue, and the people yet unborn will be able to tell it. So if you look from the rescue of verse 21 following, what you can see is that you have a ripple effect of larger and larger circles of praise, because the amazing gift of God's transformation is so dramatic and so important that you need a lot of other people to help you praise with that. Now, someone last night asked me about how the book of Psalms is organized, and what I will talk about this afternoon is that the book of Psalms ends with a big push of praise in the last half dozen Psalms, and it is as though the whole community is now joining this particular miracle, and it just becomes all praise and gladness and thanks and celebration. But you can't start there. You have to start with, my God, why have you forsaken me? You have to have enormous chutzpah in disorientation to get the drama started. I don't know how it is in Canada, but in the United States, every priest or pastor has someone come and say, my marriage is not working because he or she, my partner, is abusive and takes advantage of me and doesn't communicate with me, and I can't stand it. And then the pastor says, well, have you told him that? Oh, no, I couldn't tell him. That would upset him. It would only make it worse. And then the priest finally has to say, well, if you don't tell him, nothing's going to happen. So these Psalms, long before Freud, are the practice of breaking the dysfunctional relationship with God by having a high degree of chutzpah and calling God to account and summoning God back into a relationship upon which God has reneged. And when you read these kinds of Psalms, you want to watch. It's not always so obvious and abrupt, but you want to watch for the turn when the psalm turns from desolation to celebration, and identify that pivot point. And very many people in the church can identify a pivot point in their lives when their lives turned back into the goodness and the grace of God. Now, the second psalm that I want to talk about is in Psalm 13, and if you were ever to undertake a study of these Psalms of disorientation in the life of a congregation in a study group, Psalm 13 is a good one to start from because it's simple and clear and direct. Again, the first two verses are a complaint that describes to God the big trouble, and you will see that the big trouble is that God has forgotten, that God has hidden God's face, and therefore I have pain, and therefore I have sorrow, and therefore my enemies make fun of me for my inadequate faith. How long? How long? How long? How long? This is not a request for a timetable. This is a statement. I'm not going to put up with this anymore. So that's how it begins. It is an accusation against God. And then in verse 3, there are the petitions: consider, answer, give light to my eyes, because the darkness of death is coming over my face. And notice in the middle of the three imperatives, consider, answer, give light, there is again an identification of, Lord my God, I'm yours, I am your problem, and you got to deal with this. And then there's, again, it is as though God said, why should I do that? So here's the motivations. If you don't do this, I'm going to die. If you don't do this, my enemies will say, I've won. If you don't do this, my foes will rejoice. And what you can see other places in Scripture, they will not only rejoice over me, but they will rejoice over defeating you, God. So these prayers appeal to God's self-respect and to God's vanity. So if you don't want to save me because you love me, why don't you save me because what people will think about you? And that sometimes moves God to action. I don't know whether in Canada, do you ever conclude a prayer by saying, for Jesus' sake or for your name's sake? That means for the sake of your reputation. Do what I need to have done so that Jesus' reputation as the Messiah can be enhanced, or do it so that you'll be the God that you said you were going to be and people will honor you and worship you and give glory to you. This is really bargaining and bartering with God to do stuff for God's self, if not for me. If you have a Bible, look in Ezekiel. Your Bible is probably like mine. It doesn't easily fall open to Ezekiel. Ezekiel is back of the Psalms. It's like teaching in seminary. I never ask students to look for Haggai. It's too little. We never find it. But Ezekiel's big enough. You can leaf through and find it. This is in chapter 36. This is God's announcement that God's going to rescue Israel from exile. But look at verse 22. It is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I'm about to act. I'm not going to deliver you from exile for your sake. But for the sake of my holy reputation, I will do this, because you have made my name cheap among the nations. And then, if you read through that paragraph, verse 24, I will take you from the nations, I will sprinkle clean water on you, verse 26, I will give you a new heart, I will put my spirit within you. And it goes on to say, I will renovate creation. And the conclusion of the paragraph repeats that. It is not for your sake, verse 32, it is not for your sake that I will act, let that be known. Be ashamed and dismayed. So when you see that kind of reasoning in a prophet, you can understand why the people might have learned to pray that this God will do you some good along the way. So what I want to do now, having shown you two examples, I want to identify for you the sequence that tends to happen in these prayers, because if you get that artistic sequence down, then you can write your own lament prayers. And one of the great neighborly acts that you can do when you have someone you know who is in great distress, write a lament psalm for them about their situation and give it to them, and it will be a healing experience between you. So these prayers regularly start out with naming God and establishing intimacy. My God, I belong to you and you belong to me. Then there is a complaint. Lions, dogs, psychosomatic illness, can't sleep. Then there is a petition, and the petitions are nervy utterances addressed to God, commanding God to deliver. Now, I understand you can do that piously. You don't have to be too confrontive with God, but you can be. The television hucksters say, "Heal!" That's a kind of a nervy. They prayed that way. The fourth element is motivation, and there are many different motivations that are down and dirty. You might say, "I am innocent, and you owe me that." or I'm guilty and I'm sorry. Kids learn to work that both ways. I'm innocent, I'm guilty. You used to do this for us. What will people think? And then I think maybe the extreme motivation is, if you let me die, you need to remember that the dead do not praise you. This is assuming that God likes a choir to praise God, and if the choir loses a tenor, there'll be that much less music. Now, you see, people in orientation would never pray that way. It's all nice. But you have to do what you have to do. The fifth element that hasn't come up in these Psalms, but I do want to comment on it, and that is the vengeance. One of the objections to these Psalms is that they really want God to get the guys that have done it. So the best case for that I know is in Psalm 58, Psalm 58:6. You can imagine saying this, and then your psychotherapist says, "Is there anything else you'd like to say?" "Yes!" And he goes again. 58:6, "Oh God, break the teeth in their mouth." And you could just, in a nice congregation, you can see doing this, and you say, "The word of the Lord, thanks be to God." "Oh God, break the teeth in their mouth, tear out the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. Let them vanish like water that runs away, like grass that's trodden down. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into the slime, into the untimely birth that never sees the sun. Sooner than your pots can feel the heat of thorns, whether green or blaze, may he be swept away." Now, the word is that Christians ought not to use these Psalms because Christians ought not to feel that way. Agreed. But what do you feel that way? We do have, from time to time, yearnings for vengeance. So the question is, not should we feel that way, the question is, if you feel that way, what are you going to do with it? And I can think of only three things you can do with your thirst for vengeance. You can act it out, get a gun. We're seeing that. But people like us wouldn't do that. You can deny it. But what happens when you deny it, it tends to come out somewhere else that you didn't plan on, in your family or somewhere else. The third thing you can do, which is what Freud understood so well, you can give it over to your therapist, you can give it over to God. And I propose that's what they're doing in these Psalms. They're saying, I am being eaten alive by my anger, and I'd like to hand it off to you. Well, parents tend to know about this. Two siblings are playing in the backyard, and one of them hurts the other one, and the problem is that the parent doesn't really know who initiated it. But the one who has a little scratch with a little blood comes in the house, and like a psalmist, must use great hyperbole to get mother's attention that if you don't do something quickly, I'm going to die from this blood. You do get exaggerated speech. And you do a Band-Aid, and you think you've gotten it taken care of, but then he says, what are you going to do about him? I'll not be happy till you punish him for what he did to me. A wise parent does not say, you can't talk that way about your brother. A wise parent does not say, wait a minute, let me write this down so that I can do it. A wise parent says, why don't you leave that to me? I have heard you, and now you can leave it with me, and I'll decide what needs to be done. I think that's how these psalms, at their best, work. And the recovery of the thirst for vengeance in the Psalter, it seems to me to be an important project in the life of the church. Otherwise, people, and particularly young people, don't know that we know about that stuff. And we have known about that stuff forever. And we have devised ways of processing it to health. After you do those 5 elements of naming God, complaint, petition, motivation, and vengeance, which scholars call imprecation, characteristically, the Psalms move on to praise and celebration and the payment of vows. Now, I want to spend some detailed time on Psalm 135. I've only recently discovered Psalm 135. It's a nice long psalm. So if you, first of all, I'll scan it so you can see it begins with petition, contend, fight against, take hold, rise up, draw the spear. So these are things God needs to do. Then in verse 4, there's a lot of vengeance. Let them be put to shame. Let them be turned back. Let them be like chaff. Let their way be dark and slippery, because they haven't treated me well. Let ruin, verse 8, come upon them, and let the net that they hid ensnare them, and let it fall on them to their ruin. Then there's more complaint in verse 11. Malicious witnesses rise up again. If you have a Barry? 35. I'm sorry. Whenever I say 135, I mean 35. Thank you. Sorry, thank you for telling me. I didn't know I had said that. Okay, you got it now? You see, it's the same as I told you. Contend, fight, take hold, draw. Then verse 4, let them. So you always want to look for these repetitious cadences. Then in verse 11, if you have a local congregation in which there are some gossips that work, malicious witnesses rise up against me, and I am afflicted, and I'm a good guy, I prayed, and I grieved, and I lamented. But they, verse 15, they gather in glee, ruffians impiously mock me, gnashing at me with their teeth. You could be paranoid. Rescue me, and then it ends in praise. Now, so this is a standard song of disorientation and lament, but the interesting thing about it are the voices that occur in this psalm. First of all, there is obviously the voice of the psalmist. He's talking. Second voice, in verse 3, the psalmist says to God, say to my soul, this is what I want you to say. So God, he imagines saying, I am your salvation. Then in verse 9 and 10, when you, God, deliver me, then all my bone, not just my mouth, my whole body will say, oh, Yahweh is some big guy. You deliver the weak from those who are too strong. That's what I will say. I can imagine that's what I will say after you deliver me. Then in verse 25, Do not let the ruffians say, well, back in verse 21, do not let the ruffians say, aha, aha. Verse 25, do not let them say, aha, we got what we wanted. We have swallowed you up. And then in verse 27, they will shout for joy. My advocates will shout for joy, and they will say, great is Yahweh, who delights in the shalom of his servant. Now, this is such an interesting psalm because it's got 5 voices. It's got the psalmist, it's got imagined God, it's got imagined what he's going to say when he's delivered, he's got imagined enemies, and he's got imagined neighbors that help him to praise. So I suggest that this is a guy in bed with insomnia, and he's processing his disorientation. And when you have insomnia, you start thinking about these things, and you go over them and over them and over them, and you imagine all these conversations. So in disorientation, one may experience one's life as a cacophony of voices in dispute, all of them claiming to be the true voice of reality. And the reason I can't go to sleep is that I haven't got this sorted out. And I don't know yet what the truth of the matter is. Now you see how that led directly to Freud's theory of personality, because what Freud understood is that our personalities are layered and they are conflicted. So Psalm 35 becomes a wonderful map for processing the conflicted cacophony of the inner self that is perhaps matched to the cacophony of external reality. And the psalm is processing. Now I want to show you one other thing about this psalm. In verse 9, when you let them fall to ruin, then my soul will rejoice in the Lord. Not till then. In verse 17, rescue me. Verse 18, then, not till then I will thank you. And in verse 28, then my tongue shall tell of your righteousness. If you take these 3 thens, verse 9, verse 18, and verse 28, you can see that this is a very nervy prayer. Because the assumption is that God wants to be praised, and the assumption is that I ought to be praising God. But I'm not going to do it. I'm going to muscle God, and I'm going to leverage God, and I'm going to withhold praise until I get some action. So you want to be praised, God? Well, here's the program. I'm waiting. So here's some probably obvious conclusions. First, that these prayers are prayed with a sense of entitlement. I'm not a beggar, but I have some promise from God, and I'm going to hold God to God's promises. You may remember the last scene in Job 31 where Job appears before God. And what Job wants is an indictment. Job wants to know what he's done wrong that caused this suffering. And then he says, Job 31, if I had an indictment from you, God, I would wrap it around my head like a turban, and I would walk into your court, and I would say, did you want to see me? This is terrific. I think very much of our practice of prayer is too deferential. Second, in almost none of these psalms, you can find here and there one or two, there's no guilt. There is no thought that the trouble I'm in is because of something I've done. Third, that God can be summoned with imperatives, and you've got to decide how fertile and abrasive the imperatives are, or if they're just gentle petitions. But I suspect the depth of the emergency causes the petitions to become more abrasive. Fourth, in disorientation, God can be accused and called to account. Fifth, these prayers are in fact acts of hope. They operate on the assumption that things do not have to stay the way they are. And if you can get God's attention, God can make newness for us. So these prayers are genuinely dialogical. We sometimes say about prayers that it's a psychological activity, and if you pray you'll feel better or something like that. These prayers, you may feel better if you pray them, but the basic assumption is God will be impacted. So it's a real dialogical exchange. These prayers refuse silence. These prayers refuse denial. These prayers intend to put God at risk, calling God to account. And I dare say, see what you think, these prayers require a break with much of the church's mistaken orthodoxy. I don't know whether Anglicans have formulations like Calvinists do. I'm a Calvinist. But our catechisms all say that God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. God knows all, does all, and is all everywhere. Those are terribly unbiblical ideas. They come from somewhere else. So Israel at prayer can easily imagine that God is not present, and that God needs to be summoned, and that God may come. Now, the last thing that I want to say, and then I'll stop. Someone who was sitting here last night asked about the superscriptions about these things. I want to suggest that one of the useful ways of appropriating these psalms is to ask the question, whose psalm might this be today? Who could you think might want to pray this psalm today, or might want to have me pray it for them? And that way, what you would do would be invent a new superscription, a prayer for Linda. I'll tell you how I learned this. Linda was a long time ago, was a woman in my class on the Psalms. She was about 35. And we were reading Psalm 109, which is the worst psalm. It's a psalm that's so bad that even when the nuns pray all the psalms, they skip some verses. Can't bear it. Because it's so filled with vengeance and violence. And I said, whose psalm do you think that could be today? And that quickly, Linda answered by saying, well, obviously, that's the prayer of a woman that's been raped. That's how she feels after she's been raped, and she prays it. Get the son of a bitch that did that to me. Is that all right to say that here? Yeah. Well, you can see why I wouldn't have thought of that. So whenever I look at Psalm 109, I always imagine the label for Linda or by Linda. And it's very interesting to take these lament psalms, and you may very often you will read these lament psalms, and among nice people like us, they don't really work. So it's an invitation to get our minds off ourselves, and you might think it's a prayer by a mother in Baghdad, or a woman in New York whose husband was a guard at the Holocaust Museum, And what that will do is to help us extend our prayer life to people who are in circumstances that often is much worse than our circumstances. And if we begin to do that with some intentionality, we create a whole new universe of petitionary discourse in which we wear God down. You remember Jesus' parable in Luke 18 when he says to his disciples, pray like this woman, and this we call her importunate. I never hear that word anywhere except for this woman. But she's a widow without any social leverage, and she wants justice from the judge, and she just nags and nags and nags. And Jesus says the judge wants to go play golf, so he rules in her favor to get rid of her. And then Jesus says to the disciples, pray like that in order that you do not lose heart. It may be that the great danger for the church in the world we now face is that we will lose heart. These prayers are an offer to keep our hearts strong. Well, that's my shtick, and we have some time. Question or comment?
Dr. Brueggemann, just a comment and then a question. As you were talking just at the end there, I couldn't help but think of the movie Forrest Gump and Lieutenant Dan in the crow's nest screaming at God, come on, you son of a bitch, come and get me. It's just you and me.
Yep.
Saying, you call this a storm, and yet the following morning says to Forrest, thank you for saving my life. And he jumps into the sea that could have taken him out the day before. And boy's buoyed up by this sea of grace.
Yep.
Anyway, an analogy.
Let me just say, isn't it interesting that when the church is so anemic, it takes the arts community to remind us of our inheritance. Let me before you ask your question, did you all watch the series West Wing up here? Well, there was a scene in the West Wing where the president, I forget who that was in the National Cathedral. And he was remembering his father trying to get him not to smoke as a kid. And on the floor of the National Cathedral, he grinds his cigarette out, and then he addresses God. And it's the same kind of extraordinary artistic articulation. Yeah. Thank you. Go ahead.
The question, I work as a chaplain in a hospital, and one of the things that I discover with folks when they get to the place of actually being honest and raw is that sometimes when I go back to see them again, they've kind of out of guilt rescinded. They kind of like, gee, I wish I had not have said that. And people feel very vulnerable and they open up and then they try to say, oh my goodness, what have I let you see? Is there any, or could you distinguish for me the difference between the shift, the transition into the celebration and the concentric circles going out of praise and that, and someone kind of rescinding what it is that they've said in order to go back to orientation, so as to not be disqualified, as it were?
Yeah. On the top of my head, I can't think of psalms that would express that. There may be some. Certainly Job's friends want Job to rescind some of his extreme statements. It's an interesting question. I'll have to, but I don't know of any cases off the top of my head like that. There may be. Yeah. I think the prayers that we have, when you go back to them the next day, they're ready with some more. But I would understand that, because the church in its orientation, largely through our mothers, keeps saying, shh, shh, shh. You can't say that. And we know that even when we say it. So that's very interesting, yeah.
I work with the ecumenical community, and I believe that our rituals in church are theater, but usually very poor theater. And we've now come to something called the ecumenical consensus in liturgy, which bores me silly because it's all formulated and it's all the same and there are no surprises and it's boring. It's the antithesis of what you've been talking about. So if we need to break through that, how can we do it? Just a simple question.
Well, we need to get some new people on the lectionary committee. I think in the life of a congregation, one needs, with great delicacy and pastoral attentiveness, just to begin to get this rhetoric into the life of the church, so that people find out that men and women of faith have talked and prayed this way forever, even if we think you ought not, and to begin to reassure people. See, Episcopal Anglicans every week say, "You from whom no secret can be hid," and then we proceed for the next hour to hide all our secrets. So that's an opener. We got a few secrets here that we're going to share with you now. I just think that we need lots of study groups, lots of practice in little bits. I suspect to change that, it will not come from the top down in the ecumenical movement. It'll have to come from below, of people becoming so restless with what we got and so appreciative of more, that we begin to change that. But it's huge. Yeah, I wish I knew more. I was just recently invited to be on a consultation. The first meeting was in Rome. It was between the Lutherans and the Roman Catholics, and they invited a Calvinist visitor. I went to one meeting and resigned because I figured out they didn't want any input, and it's not worth my time to do that. So, yeah.
The Bible that I'm reading from this morning is a Revised Standard Version, and I noticed that each of the Psalms, or some of the Psalms, have a title that goes with it.
Yep.
Example 13 through 17. To the choir master, a Psalm of David. 14. To the choir master of David. 15. A Psalm of David.
Yep.
And 17, a prayer of David.
Yep.
Now, the book that we have does not use these titles, but I'm particularly intrigued with the word choir master. Could you talk on that? Well,
the assumption from the book of Chronicles is that in the late period, that is in the Persian period, there were organizations of choir directors and musicians, apparently each of which developed their own repertoire of music, and then these were all brought together. So if the book of Psalms is a collection of collections, then those little notes identify the sub-collection from which that came. The business by David or for David is commonly thought to mean that David was a word that simply meant king, and so it is to be understood as for the king, which means for the royal liturgy in the Jerusalem temple. Now that is popularly taken to mean Davidic authorship, and you know, David may have written some, but by and large, critical scholars would not think that note is for authorship, but it is locating it in the politics of church music. You know, so when you get musicians, it makes a difference whether they studied at Juilliard or at Eastman, and you follow a certain track, and that's where your music comes from. So I would think it must be like that. When we're talking about notations, I could give you one other freebie. Do you see in the Psalms the word Selah from time to time? You probably don't know what that means. That is a curse word, and it was uttered by a harpist when a string broke during the playing of an anthem. It's a musical notation, but no one knows what it means.
I think I want to pick up on Lois's comment. One of my standard ways of trying to frame the realization that we don't, for instance, in the lectionary actually read verse 9 from Psalm 137, happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock, is because we haven't been able to find a way to do anything but have an implicit go and do likewise. That's right. Sort of underneath every reading from the scriptures. And it seems to me that in order for us to be able to reclaim the rhetoric of disorientation, we have to do something rather bold to make it clear that we are not actually inviting and blessing and sanctifying the imprecation. Right. We are recognizing it is where we are.
That's right.
And in fact, it has to come therefore as a confession of where we are rather than as an encouragement to be only where we are.
That's right.
And I think we need to actually, therefore, develop an entirely better, nuanced way of reading the Scriptures so that we do not end either each reading with the Scriptures with either an implicit or an explicit go and do likewise.
Right, yeah. Right. And as you would know, many feminist interpreters in particular have warned us against using these texts that seem to authorize that kind of activity. It's very difficult to do, but it seems to me what we need to work on is to help people understand that the meeting we have in this room regularly is an artistic act of imagination. And we are here processing the unresolved stuff. I don't want to overstate, but almost like it's group therapy, in which you get to say a lot of stuff that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in here stays in here, and at its best, it's not carried outside. I understand that's exceedingly difficult to do. But Anglicans have an edge on doing this, which is to say that worship is an artistic activity, whereas Calvinists always want to treat worship as an ethical activity. And if it's ethics, then these are your warrant for what you ought to do next. But if it's artistic activity, aesthetic activity, then it's stuff to chew on and process and ponder in its complexity. Now, I think in the life of a local congregation, it's exceedingly difficult to communicate that. But it does seem to me that's what we... And, you know, the opening for that are the hymns we sing. The great hymns are huge acts of imagination which kind of suspend life in the world to imagine this incredible wonder of being in God's presence with all the hosts of heaven and all of that kind of stuff. So there's ground for that, but I understand it's a big leap from that to an artistic processing of our negativity. Yep. Thank you for that. Jeremiah Wright. You all know Jeremiah Wright? Yeah. Before he disappeared from the media, I think it was on Bill Moyers. He had this good interview before he kind of lost his cool at the National Press Club. And with Bill Moyers, he talked about Psalm 137, and he said, it is the extreme expression of a violent, failed society that is no longer willing just to kill enemy combatants, but now wants to kill enemy women and children. And then he said, that's what we've come to in Iraq. So maybe properly managed, it becomes a mirror, as you said. Yeah.
Just to begin with a brief defense of Calvinists, the ethics flows from gratitude. And the only way you're going to get to the gratitude is through praise and through being able to be honest with God.
That's right. That's right.
So there's room for us.
Thank you for that.
One of the real gifts of disorientation is that it's disorienting. And some of the complaints and struggles and the sense of entitlement that comes out of the Psalms of disorientation is really a secret attempt to reestablish the prior orientation. And, in the midst of that, you quoted Bart as saying God is moved to do the things God wouldn't do, but those aren't always the things that were asked for in the prayers.
That's correct.
And therefore, what I see is, again, God's grace working through these things and to take the people in their honesty to a different place.
That's right.
Yes, and I think that we do sometimes engage in that kind of rhetoric in an attempt to recover. But everybody knows, for example, if you take a harsh marital quarrel and you say something you think finally going to get this straightened out, that old marriage, from that moment of utterance, that old marriage is irretrievable. You cannot go back there once it's said, and you got to work at generating something new out of that. So that I think the rhetoric that may be the hope of recovery is the very rhetoric that precludes going back there. Yeah.
I'm thinking about what you said, and prior to your statement, I was going back to something that you said, an interesting statement in that you believe we are far too deferential to God in our prayers today. And I find that interesting, especially as we've all been taught not to make our prayers a grocery list. And so where is the fine line between that?
Well, it's not... I think it's not a grocery list. It is an act of honesty. And an act of honesty about what's going on in my life is much more elemental than a grocery list. And Yes, and I think sometimes it is possible that a grocery list is an attempt to avoid the honesty that is underneath. You know, I do understand that we are invited to ask God for the things we need. But I suspect when we are honest, what we discover is that the things we thought we needed are not the things we really need. That we need something else from God. I think not being deferential, I would not relate that first of all to not asking for things, but I believe it's way underneath that, about the unresolves that I cannot resolve for myself. That's what I think. Thank you for that, though. I hadn't thought of that. Here you go.
I'm just going to ask, following up on my previous stuff, why is it that after every scripture we pair, this is the word of God, when most of it isn't?
Well, I take it some liturgy committee led us to that. And people do not get on liturgy committees unless they're safe. Pardon me?
The former primate of the Anglican Church in Canada said you could get around that by just saying the word of the Lord.
Yes, right. Yeah. Or how about saying, as they say in the South, y'all be careful, you hear? But that formula that we tend to use is kind of reflective of the church's cover-up, as though we either don't read any troublesome texts, or if we read them, we don't hear them. Yeah, yeah. And I think our liturgical rubrics need to be more open and unresolved than that, I think. Yeah.
You could even say, hear what St. Paul is said to have said.
Yes, or she said you could say, hear what St. Paul is said to have said, or hear what St. Paul has mistakenly said, or something like that.
That was indeed what I was going to say. I remember about 15 years ago reading in a religious community's newsletter someone's account of having been in Australia and hearing one of my community of the Sisters of the Church finish a reading by saying, "These are the words of Paul." But, I mean, we tend to do things like, "For the word of the Lord." We've split a hair nicely there.
Right, yeah. Well, I would think that if what we're saying is we need to find rubrics that draw the Bible into the contestation rather than imagining that the Bible is always the resolution of the contest. But that requires our understanding the Bible in a very different kind of way, and our faith. Yeah.
I mean, there is also hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Yeah.
But maybe it is the Spirit isn't speaking through that passage.
Yeah. Or maybe it's a lying spirit. Hear what one of the spirits is saying to the church. I think we better stop here. I think we go as far as we.